Have you ever found yourself in a room full of laughter where the voices echo and the crystal glasses clink, but somehow not a single person truly sees you? My name is Harper Evans, and for the better part of my marriage, I felt like a guest at my own life. A quiet figure at the edge of every Whitmore family photograph, just out of focus. If you've ever sat at a dinner table surrounded by family and wondered if anyone there really knows your story, your worth, your dreams, then maybe you'll find a piece of yourself here too. Every summer, the Whitmores gather at Aspen Crest, a mountainside resort draped in pine and old money, where every corner smells faintly of cedar and Chanel No. 5. My husband Andrew walks through these weekends as if he was born to the high ceilings and perfect lawns as natural in his father's shadow as the sunrise. But me, I'm Harper, the engineer who married in. The woman who fixes bridges, not cocktails. The one who brings a store-bought salad and remembers which cousins have gone vegan, though no one ever remembers that I haven't eaten pork since I was 12. From the outside, the Whitmores are everything an American family is supposed to be: successful, well-mannered, quick with a story at the fire pit, generous with their toasts. But under the golden surface are tiny cracks, a raised eyebrow when I don't know a vintage, a subtle pause before introducing me, a quick glance between sisters-in-law when I speak up about work. Sometimes it's just forgetting my name on the dinner place cards, or assuming I'll clear the dishes while the others discuss stocks and ski trips. No one is outright cruel. That would be easy. Instead, I float through these weekends, collecting little cuts, polite but pointed, invisible but sharp. For years, I convinced myself I just needed to try harder. I thought if I wore the right dress, laughed at the right joke, offered to organize enough baby showers or holiday brunches, eventually someone would see me. I watched. I learned I did what every outsider does. I adapted quietly, hoping for a sign that I belonged. But the truth is, in families like the Whitmores, belonging isn't something you earn. It's something handed down, stitched into place before you ever arrive. All you can do is keep showing up and hope you're not too much or too little or too different for them to understand. Maybe you know the feeling, the gentle ache of being tolerated, not cherished. The way small moments of exclusion build up like snow on the roof, heavy and silent. Maybe like me, you've told yourself not to take it personally, that it's just the way things are. But what happens when the years go by and you realize you're still invisible? That no matter how many birthdays you plan or how many toasts you raise your story, your voice is always just background music for someone else's celebration. That's where my story really begins. Not at the wedding, not at the first family Christmas, but right here on the edge of the Whitmore table, at another endless dinner where my name is forgotten, my place always set at the corner, my salad brought but left untouched. I didn't know it then, but this was the season my life would shift. The summer I'd stop asking for a seat at their table and quietly build one of my own. If you've ever felt invisible in your own story, stay with me. I promise what comes next isn't just about family or even about revenge. It's about discovering the quiet strength you never knew you had and learning finally how to stand in the light. If you've ever found yourself on the outskirts of someone else's celebration, nodding along to stories you'll never quite be part of, you'll understand how it feels to be a Whitmore by marriage. I still remember the first summer I spent at Aspen Crest. I had barely unpacked my suitcase before Evelyn Whitmore, the family matriarch, offered me a brisk, efficient hug and handed me a printed itinerary complete with my assigned helping hours in the kitchen. The Whitmores believe in tradition, each member contributes, but some contributions seem more visible than others. My husband Andrew helped host a bocce tournament. His cousin Jamie arranged the wine tasting. Me, I was asked to coordinate the napkin folding and keep an eye on the little ones during dinner. I told myself it was just a welcoming gesture, that maybe next year would be different. But next year, I was still the one clearing dessert plates while everyone else moved on to brandy and stories by the fire. I wish I could say these moments didn't sting, but small things, when repeated, can leave the deepest marks. Sometimes it's the way a question is phrased. You don't mind, do you, Harper? Or the way a conversation moves around you, as if you're a piece of furniture present, but not quite necessary. There was the Thanksgiving when I cooked a vegan entree for Cousin Matt, and everyone praised Andrew for putting up with all those new recipes. Or the time I won a small industry award, only to have Charlotte, my sister-in-law, mention how lucky Andrew was that I had a hobby to keep me busy. I know these comments aren't meant to wound, but it's the quietness of the cut that lingers. I think of all the women I've met at work or in yoga class who've whispered similar stories. The daughter-in-law asked to take family photos so she won't ruin the symmetry, the newcomer to Sunday dinner, whose name never makes it onto the group chat. It's easy in families like the Whitmores to lose your shape around the edges. I learned quickly to make myself useful, to wear neutrals, to laugh at the jokes about engineers and practical shoes, to make up for not knowing the difference between Pinot Noir and Burgundy. If I'm honest, some days I didn't mind fading into the background. There's a certain safety in being invisible, a freedom to observe, to notice what others miss. But over time, invisibility can turn to loneliness. I could hear it in my voice when I'd call my mom back home in Nebraska, trying to sound upbeat as I described another charity gala, another dinner, where I carried the coats. "Harper, honey," she'd say, "don't let them convince you that you're only valuable when you're unseen." There's a real challenge in being the outsider in an established American family, especially one with a storybook legacy. I'm not the only woman I know who's been told she's so grounded code for not quite sophisticated, not quite fun. My friend Olivia, a pediatrician from Chicago, once shared how her husband's family kept introducing her as the doctor who makes time for PTA meetings, as if her career and her family couldn't coexist, as if both sides needed to be justified in polite company. These aren't tragedies, but they are the tiny daily discounts we accept until we start to doubt our own worth. There's a subtle hierarchy that no one explains, a system of belonging built on memory money and shared holidays that you're always just a step behind. Looking back, I realize I spent years hoping for a clear invitation to truly belong. I kept thinking that if I baked the best pie or volunteered to coordinate the Christmas toy drive or stayed quiet when my ideas were overlooked eventually, I'd become part of the fabric of the Whitmores' world. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that some tables are set long before you arrive, and some seats are reserved no matter how early you show up. The lesson I wish I'd learned sooner: belonging that comes at the cost of your voice isn't really belonging at all. Even now, when I think about those first years, I remember the tension between wanting to be accepted and needing to stay true to myself. There were small victories. Evelyn once complimented my lemon bars, and Charlotte started asking me for carpool favors, a sign I'd moved up in the ranks. But the truth was, I was still Andrew's wife, not Harper Evans, not a person with her own history and dreams. It's funny how you can spend a decade in someone's orbit and still feel like a satellite, always moving but never really landing. One real turning point came during a quiet moment last fall. We were sitting at the lake, the leaves burning orange and red against the water, and Andrew leaned over to thank me for making the trip so easy for everyone. I smiled, but something inside me wilted. Making it easy for everyone else had become my invisible job, one no one ever asked for, but everyone expected. That night, I stayed up late scrolling through old photos on my phone, birthdays, barbecues, holidays, and realized I was always behind the camera, never in the frame. It wasn't resentment that hit me, but a slow, sad clarity. I didn't want to disappear anymore. If you've ever felt the slow fade of your own story in the shadow of someone else's, you know what I mean? Maybe you've kept the peace at the cost of your own dreams, or stayed silent to avoid rocking the boat. There's a special kind of heartbreak in realizing the home you've built around someone else's traditions doesn't have a front door for you. But there's also a quiet power in recognizing it, and a freedom in deciding to do something about it. That realization became my first step toward change. We don't always get to choose the families we marry into or the rules of their table, but we can choose how much of ourselves we're willing to shrink to fit a seat. For me, the decision came not with fireworks or angry words, but with the simple act of honoring my own story, even if no one else would. It started with small things: saying no to a dinner I didn't want to attend, signing up for a workshop that interested me, letting Andrew handle his own family's needs instead of smoothing every rough edge. Each tiny act of self-respect felt like a pebble tossed into the lake ripples that would eventually reach the far shore. That's where my journey begins, not with a grand rebellion, but with a gentle, persistent reclaiming of myself. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't instant. But every story of transformation starts with a single moment of clarity, and this was mine. I hope you'll stay with me as I share what happened next, how my childhood, my mother's lessons, and my own stubborn hope helped me chart a course toward visibility strength and eventually the power to rewrite my place at the table. Because sometimes the first step to changing your world is remembering that you deserve to be seen in it. And the story I'm about to tell is proof that even the quietest outsider can change the shape of a family, starting with her own. Before I was ever Mrs. Whitmore, I was just Harper Evans, the girl from a 2-bedroom apartment above the old laundromat on Maple Street. My childhood was marked not by extravagance, but by the practical love of a mother who measured her days in double shifts and home-cooked meals. My mom, Janice, was one of those women the world calls quietly strong. She never complained about the ache in her feet or the hours spent cleaning motel rooms, only saying, "We do what we must." Harper, so tomorrow feels a little easier. If I wanted anything beyond what we could afford, I was told to find a way to earn it myself. So I mowed lawns, walked dogs, and later tutored classmates in math, all while my mother tucked away every spare dollar for my future. Those years taught me to notice things. Others overlooked the faded corners of our carpet, the careful folding of a lunch bag for reuse, the way my mom's smile grew tired but never bitter. We didn't have much, but I never felt poor. At least, not until I saw what having truly meant in other neighborhoods. My best friend in middle school, Natalie, lived in a house with a chandelier and 2 staircases. When I visited, her mom would serve sparkling apple juice in glass flutes and ask about my extracurriculars. I remember nodding politely, my cheeks warm, suddenly aware that working weekends at the gas station wasn't what she meant. It was the first time I realized that effort and opportunity don't always meet in the middle. There's a subtle lesson, I think, in growing up, where every dollar is earned twice, once in sweat, and again in worry. You become practical to a fault, learning to stretch a paycheck and a compliment. I carried those lessons with me all the way through college, where scholarships and late-night tutoring paid my tuition at the state university. While my classmates vacationed in Europe or debated which sorority to join, I learned to value the quiet victories a past exam, a manager's nod, the pride in my mother's eyes when I showed her my first A in engineering. Still, there was always a part of me that felt slightly out of step, as if I was borrowing someone else's life for a little while. Sometimes I wonder if the urge to disappear started there in the cafeteria line where my hand-me-down jeans stood out, or at the after-school parties I wasn't invited to. My mom, sensing this, always reminded me, "You're not invisible, Harper. You're just meant for a different spotlight." It was comforting, but as a kid, I just wanted to fit in to stop drawing attention for all the wrong reasons. I learned to listen more than speak to make myself useful, to be the friend who always stayed late to help clean up. Years later, those same instincts would serve me well in the Whitmore family, though I wouldn't understand their value until much later. It's easy when you come from a background like mine to carry a kind of invisible weight into every new room. You try not to speak too loudly about money, or the lack of it. You become careful with your dreams, trimming them down so they don't sound outlandish to people who never worried about paying rent. I remember in college, during a group project, my teammates joked about flying home for Thanksgiving. When I mentioned I'd be staying on campus to work, the conversation paused just long enough for me to feel it, the gentle, pitying distance between their lives and mine. I smiled, made a joke, and moved the conversation along, but the memory stuck with me, the feeling that my story was best kept small, manageable, unobtrusive. A real-life example comes to mind: a coworker named Rachel, who joined my first engineering firm straight out of a rural community college. She was smart, determined, and unfailingly polite, but in meetings she rarely spoke up unless called upon. When I asked her about it over coffee one day, she laughed, saying, "I guess I'm used to keeping my head down. Where I'm from, no one likes a show-off." It struck me how common that instinct is, especially for women from modest backgrounds, a learned humility that sometimes looks like shyness but is really just survival. It's the quiet belief that your value will be recognized if you just keep working hard enough. There's a danger, though, in living too long in the shadows of your own making. My mother always said never be afraid to want more. Harper, wanting isn't the same as being ungrateful. That lesson stayed with me even as I watched her sacrifice her own ambitions so I could have a better chance. It's easy to mistake gratitude for limitation, to believe you're asking for too much just by dreaming bigger than your beginnings. But as I grew older, I realized that honoring my mom's sacrifices meant building a life larger than what we started with, not apologizing for it. If there's one small lesson I've carried forward, it's this: where you start doesn't decide where you finish, but it does shape how you travel. The work ethic, humility, and resourcefulness I learned from my childhood became both my shield and my engine, driving me through setbacks and guiding me through moments of doubt. But it also made me cautious sometimes, too willing to accept the place I was given instead of asking for the place I deserved. That balancing act between gratitude and ambition, humility and self-advocacy, is one I still wrestle with even now. As I entered the world of the Whitmores, those old instincts surfaced in ways I didn't expect. Surrounded by people who'd always known comfort and abundance, I found myself shrinking again, wary of appearing too needy or too different. It's a strange thing to be both proud of your past and a little embarrassed by it, especially when everyone around you seems to have skipped the chapters on struggle. There were moments when I envied their certainty, their confidence, the ease with which they moved through the world. But I also knew deep down that the strength I brought to their table was forged in a very different fire. Looking back now, I see that every struggle, every small triumph in that upstairs apartment became the foundation for everything that followed. I may not have grown up with chandeliers or designer clothes, but I learned how to light a room with kindness, how to carry myself with quiet dignity, and how to keep going even when the odds weren't in my favor. Those lessons would serve me well, not just in the boardroom or at the family resort, but in the moments when I had to stand alone and trust that who I was and where I came from would be enough. And so, as I sat at the Whitmore table that first summer, folding napkins and listening more than I spoke, I carried with me the invisible armor of my upbringing. I didn't know it yet, but every overlooked moment, every subtle exclusion was preparing me for something bigger. What I couldn't see then was that the very things that made me feel out of place were the things that would eventually help me change the game entirely. But before that transformation could happen, I'd have to face the next challenge, learning to see and stand up against the subtle ways families draw their boundaries, and how easy it is for someone like me to be quietly left outside. That, as it turns out, is where the real story begins. There's a saying my mother used to repeat: "It's rarely the storm that breaks you, it's the steady drip." The Whitmore family didn't slam doors or shout. No one told me I didn't belong. Their boundaries were drawn in velvet, invisible, until you tripped over one and felt the bruise hours later. I quickly learned that in their world, exclusion didn't look like being left out in the cold. It looked like being left in the room but never really invited into the conversation. Take, for example, the Sunday brunches at Aspen Crest. The family gathered around the enormous oak table, sunlight pouring in, laughter bouncing off the walls. Evelyn, the matriarch, always sat at the head, flanked by her daughters, Charlotte and Isabel. I'd be seated 2 spots away, my plate already set before I arrived. As the meal unfolded, talk would turn to family history, trips to Europe, favorite prep schools, inside jokes about summers in Martha's Vineyard. Someone would ask Andrew to recall a childhood story. Charlotte would chime in, Isabel would add a memory, and the table would ripple with laughter. I would smile politely, but my own stories never found a place to land. It wasn't just the conversations, it was the way tasks were delegated. When Evelyn planned the annual charity auction, I was always put in charge of logistics, printing tickets, tracking RSVPs, setting up folding chairs. The others chose wine pairings, picked auction items, arranged the flowers. Once I suggested we try an online silent auction platform to help raise more funds. Charlotte blinked as if I'd spoken in another language, then turned the conversation back to the caterer's lemon tart. It was always subtle, never mean, just a gentle closing of the circle that let me know where my input ended. I remember the year we hosted a 4th of July picnic. I spent the morning setting up tables, arranging centerpieces, and double-checking the guest list. When the rest of the family arrived fresh from their tennis lessons and spa appointments, they mingled on the patio while I finished icing cupcakes in the kitchen. Later, in a flurry of photo-taking, Evelyn called for the family to gather for a group shot. I hesitated, spatula in hand, until Charlotte whispered, "Could you take the picture for us, Harper? You're so good with that camera." I laughed, but inside I felt like a friendly ghost present but never really seen. It's hard to explain the loneliness of microaggressions to someone who's never experienced them. They're the small, passing comments, the invitations lost in group texts, the way your presence is acknowledged, but your story is always an aside. My friend Emily, who married into an old Boston family, once confessed over coffee that her in-laws introduced her at parties as the talented violinist, never mentioning her master's degree or her work as a public health researcher. "It's like being applauded for juggling while you're standing in front of a symphony," she said. We both laughed, but I could see the ache in her eyes. For a long time, I brushed off these moments as misunderstandings. I told myself I was sensitive, that families had rhythms I'd just have to learn. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. There was the Christmas when everyone exchanged expensive gifts, and I unwrapped a monogrammed apron for your baking projects. There was the vacation when Andrew and I were assigned the smallest guest room because Harper likes cozy spaces. I told myself not to take it personally, but each little incident left a mark like tallying invisible lines on a wall. The tricky thing about microaggressions is that by themselves they seem harmless. You wonder if you're imagining things, if you're being ungrateful or dramatic. But stacked together, they build an invisible barrier, a wall that you can feel even if no one else admits it's there. Social scientists call this the accumulation effect, the idea that small slights repeated over time can have the same impact as a single large insult. I began to understand this, not just as a theory, but as the lived reality of being the outsider in a tightly knit family. There's a lesson here, one that took me years to learn. Silence in the face of subtle exclusion doesn't protect you, it only entrenches the boundaries. I saw this with Andrew, too. He was kind, gentle, but whenever I tried to talk about feeling out of place, he'd offer a squeeze of my hand and a quiet, "They mean well, Harper." It wasn't enough. Good intentions don't erase the ache of invisibility. Sometimes they make it harder because you start to question your own perceptions, doubting whether your hurt is even real. Real change only began when I started naming these moments for what they were. One evening, after a particularly awkward dinner, I wrote in my journal every time I'd felt dismissed that week. The list surprised me not just in length, but in how quickly I could recall the sting of each interaction. That simple act of acknowledgement was a small rebellion, a way to validate my own experience even if no one else would. I wish I could say that standing up for myself changed things overnight. It didn't. The Whitmore wall was centuries in the making, and I was just one woman armed with a pen and a little courage. But with each small act of honesty with myself, with Andrew, even with Evelyn, I began to see cracks in the facade. When Charlotte asked me to run errands for her third baby shower, I politely declined and suggested she delegate through the family group chat. When Evelyn made another sly comment about my simple tastes, I responded with a gentle reminder of my recent promotion at work. These were tiny acts, but each one pushed back the wall if only by an inch. It helped, too, to find solidarity outside the family. I joined a small online group for women navigating complex in-law relationships. There, I read story after story, nurses, teachers, entrepreneurs, each woman describing her own version of the velvet barrier. In their words, I found both comfort and a challenge to keep showing up, but on my own terms. It was there I first read the phrase, "You don't have to become smaller just to fit inside someone else's narrative." I copied it into my journal, underlining it twice. If you're listening to this and recognizing your own story, I want you to hear this. It's not in your head. The walls are real, but they're not unbreakable. Start by noticing, by naming, by letting yourself feel the full weight of what's happening. And then, little by little, start taking up your space again. You deserve more than polite inclusion. You deserve to belong. Looking back, I see that the Whitmore wall was both my challenge and my teacher. It taught me the difference between being included and being valued. It showed me how easy it is to accept crumbs of approval when you deserve a seat at the table. Most of all, it forced me to ask myself what kind of life, what kind of legacy I wanted to build, not just for myself, but for anyone who ever felt the sting of velvet exclusion. As I began to reclaim my own story, I realized that belonging isn't a gift you're handed. It's a space you claim sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, always, with a sense of your own worth. And the next lesson I had to learn was this: before you can ask others to see you, you have to learn to see yourself. That understanding would set the stage for everything that came next: the courage to step forward, the wisdom to invest in my own future, and the first brave decisions that would quietly change the course of my life. After a while, you start to believe there's a formula to being accepted, a secret recipe of manners, effort, and self-sacrifice. I convinced myself that if I just gave a little more, tried a little harder, maybe the Whitmores would see me as more than Andrew's wife. So I poured my energy into fitting in. I learned to bring the right bottle of wine, dressed in colors that matched the family photos, even tried to master their inside jokes, though most of the time I only half understood the punchline. I found myself double-checking every text message to Charlotte, overthinking every RSVP to a family event, and agreeing to help organize everything from birthdays to charity brunches. It's funny how easy it is to lose yourself when you're desperate for approval. My days became a cycle of anticipation and anxiety. Would Evelyn compliment the quiche I baked for Easter? Would Charlotte remember to invite me to her daughter's ballet recital? I said yes to everything, signed up for every committee, stayed late to clean up after every gathering. The truth is, I was so busy trying to be what they wanted. I stopped asking what I wanted. I ignored the quiet voice inside that wondered if all this effort was changing anything, or just wearing me out. One memory still stings, though it's softened with time. At a family New Year's Eve party, everyone was supposed to bring a dish that represented their heritage. I made my mom's Midwestern casserole, the one she always said could feed an army. When I placed it on the table, Charlotte gave a polite smile and set her French tart right next to it. Later, someone joked, "Nothing says sophistication like tater tots and cheddar." Laughter echoed, and I joined in, cheeks burning. In that moment, I felt more like a caricature than a guest of honor. I carried that embarrassment home, wondering if I would ever belong in a room like that. There's a danger in mistaking adaptation for acceptance. It's easy to think that if you keep adjusting yourself one day, you'll fit perfectly into a space that wasn't made for you. I saw this pattern in other women too. My friend Maribel married into a family of lawyers and spent her first years learning tennis, taking French lessons and attending every gala, hoping her efforts would translate into affection. But as she told me over coffee, it was never enough. The bar always moved. That's the problem with chasing external validation. It keeps you running, even when you're out of breath. At home, Andrew noticed the change in me, but struggled to understand. He's a gentle soul, the kind of man who believes everyone means well, and harmony is worth any price. When I confided in him, he would hug me and say, "Give it time, Harper. You're winning them over." But I wasn't sure I wanted to win a game where the rules kept changing, and the prize was never truly mine. His encouragement was loving, but it also felt like another subtle nudge to keep trying harder, keep giving more, never make waves. Sometimes belonging isn't about being liked, it's about being seen. I learned that the hard way at a Whitmore family wedding. I had spent weeks planning the flower arrangements, compiling playlists, and managing the RSVPs. When the big day arrived, Charlotte gave a tearful toast, thanking everyone who made the event possible. She named every sibling, every cousin, even the florist. My name was left out. For a heartbeat, I waited for someone to speak up. Maybe Andrew, maybe Evelyn. No one did. I smiled and applauded with everyone else, but inside a small light flickered out. These moments of invisibility piled up, and with them came questions I couldn't ignore. Why was I working so hard for a seat at a table that seemed determined to keep me on the edge? What would happen if I stopped trying to blend in and simply stood out as myself? I began to see how my attempts at conformity had shrunk my world, how I was bending myself smaller and smaller to fit a mold that was never meant for me. The more I gave up my own voice, the less I recognized it. Still, change didn't happen overnight. I wish I could say I woke up one morning and decided to reclaim my identity, but in reality, it was a slow, stumbling process. I started small, declining to host the family's annual Labor Day picnic signing, up for a writing workshop I'd always wanted to try, spending more weekends visiting my mom instead of attending every Whitmore event. At first, the family was surprised, even mildly disapproving. "You're not coming to the brunch. Are you feeling all right?" Charlotte asked, her tone somewhere between concern and confusion. But as the months went by, I found that the world didn't fall apart when I said no. A small but important lesson emerged. True belonging isn't bought with sacrifice. It's found in self-acceptance. The women I admired most, my mother, my friend Olivia, even Maribel, never shrank to fit in. They brought their whole selves to the table, even when it was uncomfortable. It's a risk being yourself in a place that doesn't seem to want all of you, but it's the only way to find out who's truly in your corner. Slowly, I realized I'd rather be authentic and alone than accepted and invisible. It's strange how when you stop hustling for approval, the world tilts a little. Some people draw closer, appreciating your honesty, while others pull away, unsettled by the change. Andrew and I had to relearn how to talk about these shifts. He struggled to see the cost of my endless efforts, but he loved me enough to listen. We spent long nights talking about boundaries, about what it means to support each other, about the difference between keeping the peace and keeping your peace of mind. These were hard, necessary conversations, and for the first time, I felt heard. Looking back, I see now that the struggle to belong wasn't just about the Whitmores. It was about learning to honor my story, my roots, my voice. The more I let go of the need to fit in, the more I grew into myself. The Whitmore table was never meant to define my worth. My worth had always been with me, carried from my mother's kitchen, stitched into every lesson of resilience, shining quietly in the choices I made for myself. And so with each step away from the old patterns, I made room for something new. I wasn't sure what was waiting for me, only that I was done shrinking, done hustling for acceptance. What I didn't realize then was that this quiet act of self-respect would set the stage for a turning point, a night that would change everything when I'd finally hit the wall and choose a different path. But as you'll see, sometimes the hardest part isn't standing up to others. It's standing up for yourself. That's where my story was about to turn. Some turning points in life arrive quietly, tiptoeing in on a Tuesday morning, or curling up beside you on an ordinary night. Others crash through the front door, loud and undeniable, leaving you forever changed. For me, it happened on a crisp autumn evening at Aspen Crest, surrounded by people I'd spent years trying to impress, trying to please. I didn't see it coming, but as I look back, I realized that every overlooked kindness and every ignored word had been building to that moment, one that would split my life into a clear before and after. It was the annual Whitmore Harvest Dinner, an affair with glittering candlelight and polished silver, the kind of event that appeared in the town magazine's social calendar. Evelyn sat at the head of the table in a deep emerald dress, orchestrating conversation with the confidence of someone who'd never known what it meant to be left out. The wine-flowed stories sparkled, and laughter drifted like music above the centerpiece of autumn flowers. I'd spent the afternoon arranging those flowers, polishing glasses, making sure everything was perfect as always. The meal unfolded in the usual way. Andrew was asked about his latest project, Charlotte shared news about her daughter's school play, and the conversation hopped nimbly from European vacations to stock portfolios to the best ski resorts in Vermont. I offered a story about a transportation project I'd been leading, one that was finally getting local press. Charlotte nodded, then seamlessly redirected the table to her plans for the upcoming holiday. My words slipped away unheard, as if I'd never spoken at all. A familiar ache filled my chest, one I'd learned to swallow with a polite smile. Later, as dessert was served, Evelyn turned to me and said, "You've always been such a help, Harper. We're lucky to have someone so practical in the family." It was meant as a compliment, I think, but I felt its sharp edge. The word practical landed like a stone in my lap, heavy with the weight of everything unspoken, not glamorous, not exciting, useful, but never quite enough. My heart pounded, but I kept my face steady, nodding as the others offered polite agreement. Then came the moment that broke me open. Charlotte stood to give her annual toast, a tradition that always wrapped the dinner in warmth and gratitude. She raised her glass and thanked everyone for making the evening special, listing names: Andrew for his jokes, Evelyn for her guidance, Jamie for the wine, Isabel for her charm. My name hung in the air unspoken. I waited, holding my breath, but the moment passed and the room filled with applause. I felt myself shrink the way I'd always shrunk, but this time something inside refused to bend. That night, after the last guest had left, I lingered on the back patio, the autumn air sharp on my cheeks. I thought about my mother and the sacrifices she'd made, about every holiday she'd worked, so I could have a little more. I remembered her voice, steady and soft. Never let anyone convince you your worth is invisible. Harper. Tears stung my eyes, not from anger, but from the bone-deep sadness of realizing I'd become a stranger to myself. I was tired of being grateful for crumbs. Realizing this, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos of the evening. There I was, smiling in the background, hands full of plates, eyes turned toward the action but never quite in the frame. I saw myself the way I'd been seen for years, supportive, reliable, invisible. That was the moment the ache inside me turned to resolve. I decided quietly and completely that I would not spend another year living on the edge of someone else's story. There's a strange freedom in hitting a breaking point. You stop hoping things will change on their own, stop bargaining with fate, or waiting for a different outcome from the same old script. That night, I let myself feel the full weight of disappointment, anger, and sadness, and then in the silence, I made a choice. I would start building a life that reflected my own value, not the value someone else assigned to me. If you've ever reached this kind of crossroads, you'll know what I mean. The pain is real, but so is the power that comes from finally seeing things as they are. I realized I'd spent years negotiating for scraps of approval instead of claiming my own space. It wasn't just the Whitmores' fault. I had become so focused on pleasing others that I'd neglected my own dreams, my own voice. It's a common trap, especially for those of us who learned early to equate acceptance with survival. I remember reading an article about boundary setting in families, how sometimes the only way to change a dynamic is to disrupt it completely. I thought about my friend Maribel, who once confided that she'd stopped attending her in-laws' weekly dinners, choosing instead to invest that time in her own art. At first, her absence caused waves, but eventually it forced her family to see her as a person with her own needs and ambitions, not just an extra pair of hands. There's a lesson in all of this. Sometimes you have to let things break so you can build something better. Holding everything together out of fear of being disliked, of being misunderstood, only makes the cracks deeper. It's not selfish to want more, it's honest. It's brave. By the time I slipped back inside and switched off the lights, I knew there would be no going back. I would still be kind, still be helpful, but I would do it on my own terms. My days of waiting for an invitation were over. I would start small, with boundaries and quiet acts of courage. I would let myself be seen, even if it made others uncomfortable. The next morning I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The world hadn't changed, but I had. I made breakfast for Andrew and told him gently but firmly that things needed to be different. We really talked for the first time in months about what I needed, what I wanted, and what I would no longer accept. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was real, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Looking back, I see that breaking point as a gift, painful, yes, but essential. It was the night I stopped asking permission to exist, the night I began reclaiming my place at the table. It would take time and more than a few mistakes, but I was finally ready to start investing in myself. The first step would be figuring out exactly how I wanted my life to look beyond anyone else's expectations. What came next was both terrifying and thrilling. I would have to invent my own blueprint for belonging, and that I realized was a project worth everything I had to give. And so with a shaky sort of hope, I turned toward the unknown. I was done living as a supporting character in someone else's story. It was time to become the architect of my own life, quietly gathering the courage and resources I'd need to build something entirely new. The days after my breaking point felt both weightless and charged, as if I'd finally stepped outside the Whitmore script and onto a blank page of my own. The questions came first. Who was I apart from being Andrew's wife? What did I truly want if approval and belonging weren't part of the bargain? The answers didn't arrive all at once, but they led me step by step back to the strengths my mother had seeded in me: resourcefulness, independence, and a quiet, stubborn hope that I could build something out of nothing. For years, I'd been careful with money, an old habit from growing up in a household where every dollar had a purpose. Even as I moved up in my career, I never shook the instinct to save, to tuck away small windfalls and work bonuses for a rainy day I couldn't name. While the Whitmores vacationed in Tuscany and drove new cars, I kept a battered spreadsheet tracking every expense and a separate account where I deposited anything extra: consulting gigs, freelance projects, small inheritances from distant relatives. I didn't think of it as a grand plan at first. It was just a way to feel safe in a world where nothing else felt certain. But in the quiet after the harvest dinner, I began to look at those savings differently. Instead of a safety net, I saw them as seeds, tiny overlooked beginnings, with the potential to grow into something of my own. I started reading about real estate and small business investments, poring over library books and online articles after work, often late into the night while Andrew graded papers beside me. My fascination surprised me. For so long, I'd played it safe, always cautious, always modest. Now I wondered, what if I took a risk for once, not for the Whitmores, not even for Andrew, but just for myself? The first leap was small, almost laughable in hindsight. I bought a tiny fixer-upper downtown using my bonus and years of careful savings as a down payment. The process was intimidating, filled with paperwork and terms I barely understood. I made mistakes, underestimated the cost of repairs, overestimated my own handiness, and briefly panicked when a pipe burst during my first winter as a landlord. But with every hurdle I learned. I called in favors from old friends, watched hours of DIY videos, and refused to let fear chase me back to passivity. When I finally rented the place out, the feeling of accomplishment was electric. For the first time, I had something that belonged only to me, a small, imperfect testament to my resilience. What struck me most was how invisible this victory was to everyone else. The Whitmores never asked about my long absences or noticed my calloused hands. Andrew was supportive in his gentle way, but preoccupied with his own work. I didn't share my anxieties or my wins with the family. There was something sacred about having a corner of my life untouched by their judgments or expectations. I saw for the first time the power in keeping some things private, not as a secret, but as an act of self-protection and quiet pride. Emboldened, I looked for the next challenge. I joined an investment club at work, mostly men in their 50s, swapping stock tips and war stories over coffee. I kept quiet at first, taking notes, watching their strategies, and asking questions after meetings. Slowly, I grew bolder. I invested in a handful of stocks, made some cautious bets on mutual funds, and started to see small returns. It wasn't a windfall, but it was a beginning. Each time a dividend landed in my account, I felt a little more visible to myself, a reminder that I could shape my future one thoughtful decision at a time. There were setbacks, of course. The market dipped. A tenant moved out in the middle of winter, leaving behind more repairs than I could afford. I panicked, called my mom, and listened as she reminded me, "Every problem is just a puzzle, Harper. You're good at puzzles." Together, we brainstormed solutions, and with some creativity and a lot of elbow grease, I pulled through. Each challenge became a lesson. Don't panic, don't give up, and above all, don't wait for permission to try again. I met women like me, too, quiet builders working behind the scenes, underestimated by everyone except themselves. One colleague, Jess, had started buying up old duplexes in her 20s, slowly amassing enough passive income to travel the world. She told me, "The best thing I ever did was stop waiting for someone to offer me a seat at the table. I just built my own." Her words echoed my mother's, but with a practical, no-nonsense twist that I admired deeply. There's a quiet lesson in this part of my story. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it grows in the smallest acts of self-respect, the decision to save the courage to try, the humility to learn from your own mistakes. You don't have to make headlines to change your life. All you need is a spark of hope and the willingness to build brick by careful brick until your foundation is strong enough to hold your dreams. By the time a new year rolled around, my once modest savings had grown into something meaningful. I now own 2 rental properties and a solid diversified portfolio. My confidence grew not because I'd struck it rich, but because I finally trusted myself to make decisions and recover from the ones that went wrong. I realized that my entire life had been a training ground for this moment. Every odd job, every night spent counting pennies, every time I'd been dismissed as practical or boring. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was building. The shift was subtle but seismic. I started to see possibilities everywhere, not just for myself, but for others like me, people whose quiet work was so often overlooked. I became more assertive at my job, volunteering for challenging projects, and offering my ideas without apology. At home, I set boundaries with the Whitmores, learning to say no without guilt. Andrew noticed the change and began to ask more questions, not just about my work, but about my dreams. For the first time in years, our conversations felt alive with hope and curiosity. But the biggest change was still ahead. One afternoon, while reading a business newsletter, I saw a notice that Aspen Crest, the very resort where the Whitmores held their annual gatherings, was quietly looking for new investors. My heart skipped. Could I be bold enough to step into that world not as a guest on the edge, but as a decision-maker? The idea terrified and thrilled me. I wasn't sure I could pull it off, but I knew I'd never forgive myself if I didn't try. And so the seeds of a new dream took root. What started as a quest for independence had grown into something much bigger, a vision for a future where I could finally shape my own destiny. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next steps would challenge everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, and the true meaning of belonging. But for the first time, I was ready not to fit in, but to stand out quietly and powerfully on my own terms. The decision to pursue Aspen Crest didn't come all at once. It started as a flicker, a thought I brushed away only for it to return brighter each time I heard the Whitmores reminisce about the glory days of the resort. To them, Aspen Crest was an institution woven into their family mythology, a symbol of belonging and status. For years, I'd tiptoed around its polished hallways as an outsider. Now, holding the newsletter that hinted at new investment, I wondered what it might feel like to belong on my own terms, not just as someone's guest, but as a decision-maker, a creator, a force in her own right. I began my research quietly knowing this dream was unlike anything I'd attempted before. The numbers were intimidating. The property was far more expensive than anything I'd ever touched, and the list of potential buyers read like a who's who of the local elite. I wasn't sure I even belonged in those circles. Yet, the more I learned, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just about owning a business, it was about rewriting my story. If I could step into this role, I wouldn't just change my place at the Whitmore table. I'd prove to myself that I was capable of so much more than quiet support. There were days when doubt threatened to swallow me. I'd open my laptop spreadsheets glowing with possibilities and hear Evelyn's voice in my head, practical, dependable Harper. Could I really lead a team, renovate an aging resort, and navigate the world of high-stakes investment? Memories of my first fixer-upper returned how overwhelming it had seemed, how many nights I'd cried in frustration before finding my way through. I reminded myself that courage rarely feels like a lightning bolt. More often, it's a series of small, steady steps. Each piece of research, each late-night call with my accountant became an act of hope. When it came time to approach the owners, I partnered with a colleague from my investment group, someone who taught me the ropes of property deals. We formed a small holding company, allowing us to keep our involvement private, a necessity, given the Whitmores' deep ties to Aspen Crest. My partner handled the legal and negotiation details, while I focused on the operational vision. I wanted Aspen Crest to become more than an exclusive retreat for a privileged few. I dreamed of a place where all kinds of families could feel seen, where staff were respected, and old systems were replaced with fresh ideas. It was a risk, but I was ready to stand for something, not just survive another season of polite exclusion. The negotiations stretched for months. There were setbacks. Another buyer nearly outbid us, and the due diligence process revealed hidden repairs that would cost more than I'd budgeted. I lost sleep, pored over contracts, and made hard decisions, sometimes alone, sometimes with a late-night call to my mom for comfort and courage. There was a moment after a particularly tough week when I nearly backed out, but then I remembered all the times I'd accepted less because it was easier, all the dinners where my worth had been measured by my willingness to fade into the background. I didn't want to live that story anymore. Finally, our offer was accepted. The moment was quiet, anticlimactic, just a signature on a contract, a congratulatory email from my partner, a stunned silence in my living room. No one from the Whitmores knew. Andrew was away at a conference, and I sat alone listening to the autumn wind in the trees, letting the reality settle over me. I felt equal parts terrified and exhilarated. For the first time, I was responsible for something much bigger than myself, a business, a staff, a community. It was daunting, but it was mine. As we took control of the resort, I focused first on the people. I met with longtime staff, many of whom had been quietly ignored or undervalued for years. I listened to their stories, their frustrations, their hopes for Aspen Crest. I learned more about the property's history in those first weeks than I had in all the years attending as a guest. I realized that legacy wasn't built in grand gestures, but in the daily respect, care, and attention given to every detail and every person. Together, we mapped out a plan for renovations, updated benefits, and fresh programming that would make Aspen Crest a place of real welcome. In those early days, there were moments of panic, times when unexpected expenses threatened to derail our plans, when I had to mediate disputes or make tough staffing choices. Each problem became a lesson in leadership. I remembered a mentor once telling me, "Don't wait to feel ready, just show up and solve the next thing." I clung to that advice, learning that confidence grows with each problem faced head-on, not with waiting for the perfect moment. Throughout it all, I kept my ownership private. I wasn't hiding out of shame, but out of strategy. I wanted the changes to speak for themselves, to let Aspen Crest become better before anyone could cast doubts or twist the narrative. Still, I sometimes wondered what the Whitmores would say if they knew. Would they see this as betrayal? Or would they finally understand the difference between being included and being in charge? I didn't have the answer, and for once I was okay with that uncertainty. A real-life lesson emerged from this chapter. The power to shape your destiny often requires stepping into the unknown, risking failure, and claiming your space, even if your knees are shaking the whole way through. I thought of all the women who'd inspired me, my mother, my colleagues, my friends who built side businesses and ran marathons while raising kids. Their stories reminded me that there's no single path to power, no single way to matter. You claim your place with every risk you take, every quiet victory no one else sees. As the renovations began and Aspen Crest started to feel alive again, I realized I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer waiting for a seat at the table. I was building the table itself, plank by plank, with my own vision and hands. The journey wasn't finished, far from it. There would still be difficult choices, new fears, and old ghosts to face. But I had proven to myself in the most concrete way that I was more than anyone's helper or afterthought. I was a creator, a builder, and a leader. The next test would come soon, when the Whitmores and Andrew would finally learn the truth. Would my quiet power survive their scrutiny? Would the new Aspen Crest stand strong in the storm of old expectations and new realities? For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. The unveiling was ahead, and so was the chance to finally be seen, not just by them, but by myself fully and unapologetically for the very first time. There are moments in life when the air itself seems to hum, charged with the knowledge that everything is about to change. That's how I felt the night the Whitmores arrived at Aspen Crest for their annual spring retreat, unaware that the very walls around them now bore my signature. The renovations had just finished. Fresh paint gleamed in the hallways, the staff uniforms were new, and for the first time, the welcome speech would not come from a familiar old guard, but from the new owner me. For weeks, I had rehearsed the moment in my head, wondering how it would play out, how the people who'd spent so long overlooking me would react to finding me at the head of the table. The family settled in quickly, slipping into their old habits. Evelyn ordered the staff around Charlotte, critiqued the new decor, and Andrew, sweet unknowing, Andrew asked if I'd seen his favorite cufflinks. No one noticed my quiet confidence or the way staff greeted me with a subtle nod of respect. At dinner, the manager tapped a glass and stood for a short announcement. Aspen Crest is proud to welcome the family of our new majority owner. Every head turned, expecting a stranger. When he said my name, Harper Evans, the room fell silent. It was the first time I'd seen Evelyn at a loss for words. Andrew's fork clattered onto his plate. There was a kind of poetic justice in the moment. For years, I'd stood in the wings, unseen and underestimated. Now their confusion and disbelief mirrored all the times I'd wondered if I truly belonged. Charlotte tried to recover, offering a brittle laugh, but even she couldn't smooth over the shock. Andrew looked at me, his eyes searching, bewildered. "You own Aspen Crest?" he asked, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. I nodded, meeting his gaze steady for the first time in years. What followed was a flurry of questions, half-whispered conversations, and subtle glances. The Whitmores were a family who prided themselves on being in the know, on controlling the narrative. My quiet power threw them off balance. "Why didn't you tell us?" Evelyn asked later, her tone wavering between accusation and awe. "Would you have believed me?" I answered gently. Knowing the truth they had never asked, never looked for my dreams beyond the boundaries of their own expectations. The staff, for their part, wore small smiles. Many had seen me in the early mornings, clipboard in hand, learning the resort's routines. Some told me later how good it felt to see one of the quiet ones become the boss, how the new employee benefits and training opportunities had already made a difference. One longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Dillard, caught me after breakfast and pressed my hand, whispering, "You see us. That's what matters." Her words touched me more than any family compliment ever could. The aftermath wasn't easy. Andrew was hurt, not because I'd succeeded, but because he'd missed the signs. "Why didn't you share this with me?" he asked that night, his voice thick with regret. I told him the truth, that I'd grown tired of explaining my dreams, only to have them set aside. Our marriage had been built on kindness, but also on a gentle neglect of my ambitions. It was a hard conversation, both of us fumbling for understanding. I didn't blame him, not entirely, but I couldn't carry the burden of invisibility anymore. Some silences are shared, woven from years of small decisions not to speak. Even the Whitmores, for all their pride, couldn't ignore the new order of things. When Charlotte asked for a family discount on her summer booking, I explained politely but firmly that all guests now followed the same policies. Evelyn pushed for a legacy arrangement, but I smiled and redirected her to the reservation desk, just as they had so often directed me away from family decisions. There was no gloating, just a gentle certainty that I was at last on even footing. It was in the quieter moments, though, that the reality of what I'd done truly hit me. Alone in my new office, I looked at the resort's ledger and saw the weight of responsibility, staff, guests, finances, all depending on my leadership. The victory was real, but so were the challenges. I thought of the women who had inspired me, Jess, with her duplexes, my mother working night after night, Mrs. Dillard quietly holding the place together year after year. Their strength wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about building something that lasted even when no one was watching. A real lesson from this chapter is that recognition can feel empty if you achieve it only to prove a point. What matters most is not the applause or even the surprise on the faces of those who doubted you, but the quiet pride of knowing you've stayed true to yourself. I realized I hadn't bought Aspen Crest to gain the Whitmore's respect. I had done it to honor my own values and to make a difference in the lives of others, especially those who are so often overlooked. As the week went on, things slowly settled. The Whitmores learned to navigate the new rules. Andrew and I talked sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with the old warmth returning. There were no big confrontations, just a steady renegotiation of boundaries and truths. I watched as staff flourished under new management, as families arrived who looked nothing like the Whitmores, finding welcome and comfort. I saw myself reflected in their cautious hope, their growing confidence, their willingness to claim a space in a world that once seemed closed. And so the resort became a living symbol of everything I'd fought for, not just success, but transformation, mine and everyone else's. But I also knew the hardest part was still ahead. Owning my power meant facing the cost of change, the strain on my marriage, the discomfort in family gatherings, the fear that I might lose the love I'd worked so hard to earn. Was it possible to keep my newfound strength without sacrificing everything else? That's a question that haunted me even as I moved forward. And as I would soon discover, claiming your place in the world sometimes means letting go so something new and truer can take root in its place. Victory, I soon learned, has a flavor more complicated than the stories ever tell. The days after the reveal at Aspen Crest were filled with ripples, some subtle, some crashing. Suddenly, every relationship in the Whitmore family shifted. I had crossed an invisible line. Even small conversations felt changed. Evelyn's smiles became tighter, her questions laced with curiosity and suspicion. Charlotte, who once asked for favors without thinking, now hesitated before calling. Andrew seemed lost in a fog, trying to reconcile the wife he thought he knew with the woman standing before him. The hardest moments came quietly. Sometimes when the dining room echoed with the laughter of new guests and my staff's cheerful greetings, I'd step outside for a moment just to breathe. The view was as beautiful as ever, but I saw it with new eyes, aware of how power can isolate as much as it can uplift. I thought about Mrs. Dillard, the longtime housekeeper who told me everyone wants to be the boss until they find themselves alone in the office at night. I understood now. The warmth of recognition, the pride of accomplishment, they're real. But so is the loneliness that can follow when you step out of the familiar and into your own strength. Andrew and I tried to bridge the distance between us. We walked the grounds together, talked late into the night, but the questions between us kept growing. "Why didn't you trust me with your dream?" he asked gently one evening, his hand covering mine. I struggled to explain it wasn't about secrecy, but self-preservation. For years, I'd tried to make myself smaller for his sake, for his family's peace. I needed this one thing to be mine, unapologetically, unshared, undiluted. In the end, I told him I needed to know I could do something on my own, that I mattered even if no one else saw me. His eyes were kind, but sad. "You do matter," he whispered. But I realized that sometimes love can't undo the weight of old patterns. Some lessons we have to learn alone. I thought often about the notion of forgiveness, both for myself and for the Whitmores. There was anger, of course, resentment for the years I'd spent unseen, for the moments they made me feel less than whole. But anger, if held too tightly, becomes a second prison. I remembered my mother's words. "You can be right, Harper, or you can be free. Don't let old hurts keep you from the future you've worked so hard to build." Slowly, I let go, not forgetting, but refusing to carry the bitterness forward. I found myself able to greet Evelyn with honest warmth, to thank Charlotte for small gestures, to accept that the Whitmores might never truly understand my journey, and that was okay. Change, I discovered, comes with a cost. When the summer ended and the Whitmores returned to their own routines, Andrew and I faced a hard truth. Our marriage had been built on affection, yes, but also on my willingness to hide parts of myself. Now that I stood in the light, there was no way to fit the old shape. We parted gently with gratitude for what we had shared, and respect for the paths we each needed to walk. Letting go was painful, but it was also a relief, a release from the quiet ache of never being fully known. There were losses I hadn't anticipated. Some old friends drew away, unsure of what to make of the new, bolder Harper. I was no longer the one who always said yes, always made things easy. I made mistakes, an investment that went sour, a staff member who felt I'd changed too much too quickly. But there were unexpected gifts as well. A staffer named Carla, once shy and withdrawn, approached me after a team meeting. "You gave me the courage to ask for a promotion," she said. "Watching you lead, watching you change, showed me I could do it too." In moments like that, the cost of growth felt worth it. There's a lesson I hold close from this chapter of my life. Power isn't about domination or applause. It's about responsibility toward yourself, your values, and the people who depend on you. Real power demands humility and an openness to learn to apologize to keep growing. I tried to lead by example, admitting when I was wrong, taking time to listen, and inviting others into the process. In the quiet, I found a different kind of belonging, the respect that comes from being both strong and kind. Forgiveness, I learned, is also a kind of freedom. I forgave myself for the years I'd spent silent for every dinner where I held my tongue. I forgave the Whitmores for being trapped by their own traditions. And I forgave Andrew, who loved me as best he could. In doing so, I made space for joy to return, not the approval of others, but a deep, abiding sense of pride in who I'd become. Looking back, I see now that claiming my power meant accepting the whole truth, both the gains and the losses. It meant grieving what couldn't be salvaged and celebrating what I'd found along the way: confidence, resilience, and a capacity to create real change. I'd become the kind of leader I once searched for: visible, generous, and brave. As the leaves turned gold and Aspen Crest filled with new families and stories, I knew my journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead: business decisions, new projects, old memories that stung on quiet nights. But I no longer lived in fear of being overlooked. I had learned to take up space, to trust my own voice, and to make peace with the imperfections of my story. And so, with the autumn wind stirring in the pines and the laughter of guests echoing in the halls, I looked forward. The final lesson was waiting, the lesson of giving back, of turning my hard-won seat at the table into a place where others could gather, grow, and find belonging of their own. That's where my story was headed next. There's a kind of quiet you only find after a long storm, the kind that settles into your bones and lets you finally breathe again. In the months after reclaiming my place at Aspen Crest, life moved at a new rhythm. The resort flourished, but so did I, bit by bit. For the first time, I saw myself not through the eyes of the Whitmores or even Andrew, but as the woman I'd become through struggle, hope, and all those little acts of courage. Every overlooked moment and every private victory had shaped me. The girl from the upstairs apartment, the practical daughter-in-law, the silent saver, she'd always been there, just waiting for her story to unfold. Looking back, the lessons come clear. Belonging isn't given, it's claimed. Acceptance that costs your voice isn't acceptance at all. It was in the act of standing up for myself, of daring to invest in my dreams, risk being misunderstood, and gently say no to old patterns that I finally discovered my worth. Power, I learned, grows quietly in the choices you make each day to honor your story and lift others alongside you. I found that real transformation happens not just when you take your seat at the table, but when you build a bigger table for everyone who needs a place. The cost of becoming visible was real changes in my marriage, old friends drifting away, learning to let go of the need to be liked by everyone. But what I gained was so much greater a voice I could trust, new friendships rooted in honesty, and the pride of leading with empathy. I saw my staff and guests blossom under new opportunities, watched other women step forward with their own ambitions, and realized that my story was no longer just about healing old wounds. It was about helping others see their own power too. If there's one thing I hope you'll remember from my journey, it's that you never have to settle for being invisible. You are allowed to want more, to dream bigger, to stand tall, even when your knees shake. Your story matters not when someone else finally notices, but when you decide it's worth telling. So, if you've ever found yourself on the edge of the room, wondering if you belong, know that you're not alone. You can change your life sometimes in small steps, sometimes with bold leaps. All you need is the courage to begin. Now, I want to hear your story. Have you ever felt overlooked or underestimated? What was your turning point? Drop your experience in the comments. I promise someone out there needs to read it. If this journey resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, and share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their own worth. Together, let's keep building spaces at our tables, in our workplaces, in our lives, where everyone can be seen, valued, and heard. Thank you for walking this path with me. My story is still unfolding, and so is yours. And if you ever wonder whether one quiet voice can change the shape of a family, a workplace, or even a legacy, remember it starts with the courage to tell it.